last time we did production, which is supply in the short run. Now what we do is production and cost in the long run. Production and cost, of course, is associated with supply. So, the first concept of production, especially in the long run, is that of an isoquant. So, isoquant is the combination of inputs for which produce the same quantity of output. So, you may produce, for example, 500 cars with a lot of machines and few workers, or 500 cars with few machines and a lot of workers. So, the isoquant will give you the combinations of inputs for which you achieve a given quantity of output. So, all possible combinations capable of producing a given level of output. Isoquants are always downward sloping. Downward sloping simply means that if you reduce the, let's say, the input of labor, in order to maintain the same output, you must increase the input of capital. In other words, downward sloping means that there is a trade-off between inputs. And trade-off, if you remember from the very first lecture, is the most important characteristic of economics. Trade-off is the defining characteristic of economics. You can't get something for nothing. Trade-off means if you want to maintain the overall output, you want to reduce the one input, then you must increase the other input, and vice versa. You can't just cut one input and still maintain the same benefit. So this downward slope represents the most fundamental concept in economics, which is that of trade-offs. Here is an example of a couple of isoquants. On the horizontal, you have input of labor, input quantity of labor. On the vertical, you have the input of capital, how much capital you use. If you want to produce 100 units of output, say 100 cars, you can use 75 workers and 10 units of capital. Or, alternatively, you can use 40 workers and twice more. We call these capital, we just call them in general economics machines. And then, if you want to reduce the number of workers to 20, you have to, again, double quantity of machines from 20 to 40. So, this represents one isoquant. The next isoquant, 200, is in a very similar manner, shows you the combinations. So, one after another, this whole picture is called an isoquant map. An isoquant map. So, what is a marginal rate of substitution? Well, marginal rate of substitution is a concept which is similar to what we had about demand. It simply tells you how much you should, how many units you should increase from one input in order to compensate for one input from the other. In other words, if you want to reduce the number of workers by one, by how many units you have to increase capital to compensate one worker. So this is called marginal rate of technical substitution. For example, you have, let's say, 500 workers on the factory floor. The simple question is, what do we need to do to cut the number of workers from 5 to 400? In other words, how many extra machines we need to add to compensate for 100 workers and still maintain the quantity produced. The quantity produced. Well, it turns out that the isoquant itself is represented by the slope. I'll put back the previous chart that we had over here. So, here to here, you can look at it. Let's see, mouse. Let me move the mouse. From this point to this point, you can think of the marginal rate of technical substitution as this particular slope. Here, the change is of 35 workers, and here the change is of 10 capital. So, when you look into capital for labor, the ratio is 3.5. 35 workers divided by 10 units of capital. So, marginal rate of technical substitution, you have to be careful. Are you talking about labor for capital or capital for labor? If labor for capital is actually 3.5, then the other one will be 1 divided by 3.5. So, this is the simple concept. It represents the slope, and you can have it at a particular point. So, at one particular point, you can actually see the slope. You can also see that the slope is steadily changing, which is coming in a few minutes. So, marginal rate of technical substitution will also be represented by the marginal product of labor divided by the marginal product of capital. So, if one worker is producing 10 more units, and one machine is producing 5 more units, extra, one extra machine, 5 more units. So the marginal product of labor is 10, the marginal product of capital is 5. It turns out that the marginal rate of technical substitution, the ratio is simply 2. Simple as that. Alright, so as labor is substituted for capital, marginal product of labor declines and marginal product of capital rises. Let's explain this. It's very simple, very basic. I've done it before. Let me repeat the explanation over here. You got 10 taxi drivers and how many? 5 taxis. You increase one more taxi, suddenly the marginal product of each taxi driver will increase. Before they do shift 12-hour shifts, now with 6 taxis they can do actually 14-hour shifts each. So as you increase the number of taxi, the cars, you increase the marginal product of each worker. The opposite is certainly true. If you reduce the quantity of capital per worker, the worker productivity or marginal product of worker falls. So, as labor is substituted for capital, the marginal product declines. In other words, you add extra labor, you add one more taxi driver and one more taxi driver, of course the marginal product of each taxi driver will fall. So you have 5 taxis, you have 10 taxi drivers, they're making certain output, you throw in an extra 11th taxi driver, his marginal product will not be much higher. It's going to be lower than the previous guy. You throw in 21st, 25th or 30th taxi driver, the marginal product will be extremely low. So as you add more and more workers, necessarily the marginal product of labor declines. In this particular case, when you substitute labor for capital, means you will lower the number of taxis and will increase the number of taxi drivers. For example, 5 taxis, 5 drivers. You want to cut down the number of taxis to 4, you got to increase the taxi drivers to 6 or maybe 7 in order to maintain the same number of traffic, the same number of customers and the same number of revenues. But lowering the number of taxis and increasing the number of workers will necessarily lower the marginal product of the last worker. And quite similarly, or with the same logic applies with capital. As you increase the number of workers, in other words, if capital has more workers to work with, the marginal product of capital increases. 5 taxes, 5 workers. If you have 5 taxes, 6 workers, the product for each taxi will increase, right? It's perfectly natural. So, as you increase the number of workers and reduce the number of taxes, the marginal product of workers falls and the marginal product of taxes or machines, or we call it capital, increases. It's a basic relationship. So as you get to substitute and you see the marginal product of labor falls, the marginal product of capital rises, this falls, this rises, so the marginal rate of technical substitution will constantly fall. Well, this is the slope of the curve. Alright, so next concept besides Isoquant is the Isocost. Isocost curve is the curve which provides you different combinations of inputs for which the cost remains the same. In other words, you still pay the same amount of money for those inputs. Alright? So, this formula, didn't figure out what it is. It's not great. It's just a computation. It's just a computation of capital as the total cost. But there's no real good meaning. I didn't see any good meaning. So this is what an isocost curve is. So the isocost curve will have usually be a straight line. A straight line, we say, has a constant slope. So the isoquant curve will actually be a curve, and the isocost curve will be actually a straight line. The reason it is a straight line is because on the market you could substitute labor for capital at a fixed ratio. The ratio is that of their relative prices. So the substitution of labor to capital is simply the cost of labor, which is W, and the cost of capital, which is R. We call it return on capital. So the slope of an isocost curve is the negative of the input price ratio. So the isocost curve, the interpretation is how you can trade off inputs on the market. The first one, the Isoquant curve, tells you how you can trade off inputs technologically. So, the logic should be what we had from quite a few lectures ago, if you would remember, that some sort of optimization will occur where the technological rate of substitution will equal to the marginal rate of substitution, which is coming. Alright, so back to isocost curves. It's just a simple example. If you hit the one, for example, the ordinate, if you hit the ordinate, it tells you the quantity of capital that you can buy when you're not buying labor. Over here, it shows you the quantity of labor that you can buy, again, with the same budget. The isocost curve in production theory is the corresponding concept to the budget line of the consumer. So, consumer had a certain budget to spend on apples and oranges. Well, the manager's got certain money or budget to spend on labor and capital, workers and machines. So, the quantity of workers that the manager can buy when he buys no machines at all. And then the points in between represent various attainable combinations for the same amount of money, for the same costs associated with these inputs. Well, this represents one cost level. The next curve represents a different, higher cost level, and it's simple as that. Alright, so there comes the optimal solution, optimal combination of inputs, and what you try to do is one of two things. It's always the same in economics. You either fix the cost and then you try to produce as much as you can, Or the opposite. You fix the quantity and you try to spend the least, no, not less, the least possible amount, the minimum cost. So, for a given quantity, what is the minimum cost? Or vice versa, right? So, maximizing cost by choosing the input combination on the Isoquant for which it is tangent to the Isocost curve. So, tangent means trade-off. The trade-off on the one, the trade-off of the cost is identical to the trade-off of the marginal rate of substitution. So, when they're tangent to each other, it necessarily means it's elementary mathematics. Two curves are tangent only when their slopes are equal. So, the two slopes are necessarily equal. So, what we have is marginal rate of technical substitution. The slope was marginal product of labor divided by marginal product of capital from 3-4 slides ago. And the slope of the Isocost curve was, if you remember again, this one is the minus and also this one is the minus, so minuses are gone. Simply the ratio of prices, the wage rate to the capital rate, we call it the rate of return on capital. So, simply the price ratio divided by the technological or productivity ratio. And now, of course, you can rearrange. W comes underneath and R goes over here. So, what actually marginal product of capital goes up. So, what you're getting here is marginal product of labor divided by wage equals marginal product of capital divided by the return or cost of capital. What is the meaning of this particular relationship? This relationship is true only at optimality. Only at optimality. It means that the extra product of labor on an extra dollar of labor, so when you spend let's say $100 more on workers, the extra product that you get will be the same as if you spend the $100 on capital with the extra product of capital. So, what this means is the marginal or extra product that you're getting out of labor, out of dollar spent on labor, is the same as the extra benefit or extra product that you're getting on capital. So, when you're considering on a per dollar spent, the marginal productivity of each factor, production factor, must be the same. For example, if putting in an extra worker, you get for $1, you get $2 of extra product, it must be at optimality that by using $1 more on machines, you're going to be getting $2 more at output. Well, of course, if this ratio did not hold, then you're not at optimality because you can trade off. You can cut down on the one and increase on the other. Whichever, for a $1 more will give you a higher marginal product. For example, if marginal product of capital is 2 and the marginal product of labor is 5, what you want to do is cut $1 from capital, you're going to lose 2, you're going to put it in labor, you're going to gain 5, and you're going to increase a net 3. So, as long as the one is higher than the other, you're going to be cutting on the one with a lower marginal product and substituting into the one with a higher marginal product until they equalize. That's it. So, the equality means you can't shift from the one to the other and gain. Well, then you are at an optimal point. Well, there you have it on a picture. So everything that I've been explaining is actually right over here. Here is the curve. You can actually use, this is the Isoquant. This represents here the Isocost curve. Point E is the optimal point. The slopes are, number 1, identical. Number 2, they have the same change. And number 3, for this cost, this is the highest isoquant that you can get. If the isoquant is on the outside, it is unattainable, meaning you cannot produce on that isoquant with this particular cost. If it is inside, this simply means that you're producing a lower quantity for a given cost. So the only way that you can get is for a given budget to get the outwardmost isoquant, which still is attainable, which means still touches the isocost. So the two curves are tangent to each other, fairly straightforward. Here is an example between A and B, which I was kind of like explaining a minute ago, where if you're from point A, you can substitute into B. You maintain the same quantity of the output, which is 10,000, but you can effectively lower the cost. And you can do this lowering until the point of tangency occurs. Again, no magic. The logic of production here is identical to the logic of consumption. If you studied and understood consumption, nothing has changed here. Everything, all the concepts are a repeat of consumption. We use the same tools: marginal product, marginal utility, marginal rate of substitution, etc. With marginal rate of technical substitution, it's all the same.
So point E is the optimal solution?
In this particular case, yes. Is the optimal solution when the quantity is 10,000? Yes. So it is the optimal solution if you want to produce and sell 10,000 on the market. Right. If you want to sell 5,000 on the market, you will have to go somehow inside here, and it's going to be somewhere over here. Depends on the nature of the isoquants. So yes, E is the optimal point when the quantity of output is, or the desired quantity of output is 10,000. Yes. Questions? No? Well. Alright, so now we're getting to the next concept, which is expansion path. And the expansion path is the extension of the previous concept. So the expansion path I'm going to return back is, if you wanted the quantity to be 10,000, E is the optimal point. If you want the quantity to be 1,000, so it's something like this, you're going to get one point here. Then, if you want it to be 2,000, you're going to get the next point. Then, if you want to be 3,000, you're going to get the next point. So, for each quantity, you get for each quantity of output, you get the optimal combination of labor and capital. Picture should be coming. There it is. So, if you wanted to produce 500, you will be, this is the 500, you will be on this particular isocost. The isocost is that of 3. The cost is, oh, sorry, this is the 300, 150. We don't have actually the cost, the number of costs. You will be at point A, and point A is the optimal point for a quantity of 500. For a quantity of 700, the optimal point is B. For a quantity of 900, the optimal point is C. What is important to notice is that this curve, which we call the expansion path, does not have to be a straight line. In other words, early on in the process, you might benefit more by adding in extra capital. Later on in the process, you might be benefiting by adding more extra labor. Down the road, there's a chance or a very good possibility that in order to, be at optimality, you have to add a lot more capital. In other words, there is no constant ratio between labor and capital. For example, this university wants to expand by a certain amount, and we want to be, in this case, remember, this whole chapter is on long-term. University want to be at its long-term optimality. For example, we want to double the number of students. It is not necessary that we have to double the number of buildings, meaning like capital, the number of rooms which we teach students, and doubling at the same time the number of professors. That's not necessary. It may be quite optimal that we increase the room capacity by 50% and we increase professor capacity by 250%. Alright? Because building one more building could cost 10, 50, 20, 50 million dollars. Buying extra 5 professors isn't going to cost even 1% of that amount. So it may be that early on the expansion path, the optimality in the expansion path is hire more and more and more professors. Then it will be, well, we've had enough professors now. If we want to continue to expanding, we got to expand it with more and more and more buildings, premises, rooms, etc. So it is not necessary. So the expansion path shows you the optimal quantity of labor and capital for each quantity of output. So this is the optimal quantity of 91 and, let's see, because I got this, 91 and 148, and this is at B over here, and at C over here it's 200 and 150. So for each quantity of output, it tells you what's the optimal quantity of labor and of capital. The assumption is that we can change the quantity of labor, and the assumption is that if we choose, we can change the quantity of capital. In other words, the underlying assumption of this whole analysis is that both inputs are simultaneously variable. We can change both as we like, both as we choose. And this is the definition of? No, long run. Short run is defined as one or more inputs are fixed. We are, in this university, operating in the short run. We have so many rooms, let's say 53 rooms, and that's it. We can increase number of professors, bring in one more, but we can't easily increase one more rooms. Now, the university is building a brand new building, right? And when it's up and ready, we're going to expand with another 50 classrooms like this one. But until that point, we are living in the short run. Once we expand, we're going to be living in the short run again, because we're going to be stuck with these two, buildings, and then suddenly the only way to expand capacity again is build a third building, which could be 2, 3, 5, 8, or 20 years down the road, whatever the circumstances are of the university. If there is demand, students, professors, of course, profitability, a whole range of issues, whether to expand long term. So the slope of the expansion curve from the origin, which is not shown here. So this slope here represents the optimal ratio of labor to capital. All right? Very high slope will indicate a lot of capital with a little labor, and very low slope will indicate a lot of labor with relatively little capital. Most of the times, it will depend on the nature of what you're trying to do. For example, for Saudi Aramco, the expectation of optimality is extremely high capital and relatively low labor. In this particular case, we say that the business or the industry is, not in the chapter, capital intensive. So a capital intensive business is a business whose long-term optimality requires an extensive amount of capital and relatively small amount of labor. Alright, so returns to scale, I have found the best way to explain it is like this. If you double the number of workers and you double the number of machines, are you going to be able to double production? If you are able to triple production, then we say that you gain economies of scale. All right? If you double the number of workers and capital and everything else, meaning you double the quantity of each productive input, if, for example, we increase them by 100%, but output grows by only 50%, we say that we have this economies of scale. So, we call it increasing returns to scale. When you, for example, double inputs, output triples. Constant returns to scale simply says or means if you double inputs, you double output. And decreasing returns to scale means you triple the inputs, but you can barely double the output. All right? So, that's very intuitive. Technically, it is measured in percentages. If we increase inputs by 1%, will output increase by more than 1%, by less than 1%, or exactly by 1%? If it's more, we call it increasing returns to scale. If it's less, we call it decreasing returns to scale. If they increase 1 for 1, meaning 1% of inputs results in 1% of output, then we call it constant returns to scale. That's fairly straightforward. Alright, so long run costs is simply long run total cost for a given level of output is simply the wage rate multiplied by the optimal quantity of labor, optimal received from the previous chart or from the Isoquant, or sorry, from the expansion path, multiplied by the price of capital times the quantity of capital. So, price times quantity plus price times quantity. And it gives you the total long-term total cost. Alright. Now, when you divide the long-term total cost by the quantity, you simply get the long-term average cost. This is a fairly straightforward definition. A definition for any average cost is simply the corresponding total cost divided by the corresponding quantity of output. That's elementary. That's perfectly intuitive. This is the intuitive definition that we use. So, long-run average cost measures the cost per unit of output when production can be adjusted to the optimal amount. In other words, this is the long-run average cost, is the cost when you produce at optimality, when both labor and capital are at their optimal quantities. That's, of course, in the long run. Well, what if someone is not producing at optimality, meaning that their cost is higher than the optimal cost? In other words, their average cost is higher than the industry-wide average cost.
We should add, we should put more quantity?
No, they will not be able to make any profits, and if they're not able to make any profits, they're going to go out of business. Alright, this is kind of like the next chapter. In other words, the long-run average cost has to be, for competitive industries, has to be the same. If it's not the same, those with higher cost will be driven out of business by those with lower cost, as long as the industry is competitive. You can think, what will be a highly competitive industry in Saudi Arabia? Maybe taxes. You know, someone has twice the cost and whatnot. Of course, he's going to be driven by the much cheaper taxes over time. You know, you can't just post twice the, or charge twice the price constantly. This is your actual cost for whatever reason. All right, so usually the long run average cost has a classic U shape. I think it is coming. Classic U shape means that as you early on increase the quantity, average cost falls. And over time, in other words, with increasing quantity, then average cost increases. Falling average cost indicates economies of scale. Why? as you increase the quantity supplied, as you increase output, if your average cost falls, it must be that you are gaining from economies of scale. In other words, if your average cost is falling, it's got to be the case that you are gaining from economies. You must have economies of scale. Vice versa.
What's economies of scale?
Economies of scale is from 2 slides ago. Economies of scale is the same as increasing returns to scale. Increasing returns to scale is known as economies of scale.
It increases more there.
Yes, increases more. In other words, when you double the inputs, the output can actually triple. So we call this economies of scale. The decreasing we call diseconomies of scale. Diseconomy. They should have put it in here. Diseconomies of scale. So increasing returns to scale indicates economies of scale is the same as increasing returns to scale. Rising average cost means diseconomies of scale. Decreasing returns to scale. In other words, when the cost begins to rise, you're switching into inefficiency mode. When your cost is falling, you are improving your efficiency. Of course, efficiency is the concept associated with the cost of output, the cost of production. Falling cost, or at least falling average cost, means improving efficiency, and rising costs means worsening, decreasing. We call it deteriorating efficiency. Of course, falling cost can come from increasing returns to scale, and rising cost must come from decreasing returns to scale. So, returns to scale is associated inherently with cost and is associated inherently with production efficiency.
Can you move the mouse because it's on your face?
Oh, on my face. All right.
Okay, because I'm distracted.
All right, so long-run marginal cost. So a little while ago, I was talking about long-run average cost. Now we're talking about long-run marginal cost. It measures simply, what is the increase in cost when you move along the expansion path. In other words, when you want to increase the output by 1 more unit, what's going to be the extra cost? For example, if Saudi Aramco wants to produce 1 more barrel of oil, what's going to be its extra cost?
$16,000.
$16,000?
Yeah.
Is this how expensive is the extra barrel? 1 single barrel?
1 single barrel extra.
16,000. Wow.
Yeah. It used to, a few years back, it was 4,000.
It's now 6,000. So you'd rather not increase at all. But the question is, if you reduce the output by 1 barrel, are you going to save 16? Huh? Are you going to save 16,000?
No.
No? So what you're
You have the same labor and machines.
you have the same labor and machines. So if you have the same labor and machines, why increasing by 1 barrel is so costly if you still have the same labor and machines? Makes no sense.
No, because it's the extra field that.
You gotta tap into a brand new field.
Yeah, we have
okay.
technology,
The technology and everything else.
Industrial.
Okay, so what we are talking about here is that the cost structure has jumps. You have relatively low cost structure for the first field, then it jumps for the second field, for the third field. So now what you're saying is you're exploiting maybe 10, maybe 12 fields. If you want to produce one optimally, and if you want to produce 1 more barrel, you actually have to tap 1 more field. And tapping 1 more field is extremely costly. So when then you put in the cost of that 1 extra barrel, then the second barrel should be really cheap, right? Because you already have the first barrel. In other words, the first barrel from the field is always extremely expensive. But then the second one's got to be very cheap, and the third one even cheaper, and so forth. So the long run marginal cost is typically U-shaped. Early on it falls, later on it rises. It lies below the long run average cost. This is identical to what we did in the short run. The logic is the same. So, as long as the long run average cost is falling, the marginal has to be underneath. And if the average cost is rising, the marginal has to be from above. It has to cut through from the low point. This is just an example which I will simply skip, or of course you can just look at home. So, there it is. This is the total cost, and you see what's happening here. When the marginal cost is below, the average cost is falling, then the marginal cost cuts through or pierces the average cost at its minimum, and then when the marginal cost is above the minimum, the average cost is rising. And this is the chart. So at first it is falling, then it is rising. What is important to understand is that the long run average costs, again, is also falling and then rising. They also, this one is from below when falling, from above when rising, cutting through right at the very minimum. And each has a U shape. This one has a U shape, and this one has a U shape. U shape simply means falling early on, rising later on. Alright, that's all that U shape means. And this is identical to the short run because the logic of average costs and marginal cost is identical. The definition is identical. So the picture, the concepts, the explanations, everything is identical. Alright, so what might be different shapes of long run average cost curves? Well, number one is it falls very early, it bottoms very early and begins to rise real fast. These businesses are typically not scalable. Scalable means you can easily expand the output without actually rising cost. An example of scalable business is this one. You can easily double, triple, quadruple, quintuple, etc. You can increase many times the output and costs don't rise. And this is a cost where you actually, the more you increase, would be the more you pump oil, the lower will be the cost early on. And of course, later on, it's going to skyrocket. So some industries will have a very, very, very long and falling average cost. Examples will be, anybody?
Oil.
Huh? Oil, yes. What else?
Gas.
Gas, yes, of course. What else? The general industry of utilities, water utilities. Water utilities, you double, triple, increase 10, 50 times the quantity of consumers, the cost keeps falling and falling and falling. We call this highly scalable, alright? They sometimes call it in economics natural monopoly. Natural monopoly is the term which describes an industry where one business has constantly falling average costs as the quantity increases. Electricity is the classic textbook example of continuously falling long-term average cost, which falls for a long time. Another example of such industry is airlines. And yours is?
Internet maybe?
Internet, yes of course, yes of course. Internet, let's call it internet providers will be an example. Just providing internet to one person is not very efficient, but beginning to provide the internet to the whole city suddenly begins to make a lot of economic sense, meaning costs begin to fall and therefore you expect it to be more profitable with falling average costs. So this is extended economies, which in microeconomics is known as natural monopoly. Alright, so constant long-run cost when constant returns to scale occur over the entire range of the output. In other words, you double the quantity of inputs, the quantity of output doubles, then you're going to be facing constant long-run cost. It's perfectly logical. Nothing really magic. And the long-run average cost is flat, meaning horizontal, and the long-run marginal cost, n equals the long-run marginal cost. Otherwise, long-run marginal cost is also horizontal and coincides with the average cost. Usually these are typical for very small services. Very small services could be massage services or sometimes legal services like tax preparation. Tax preparation services, it takes maybe 30 minutes or 2 hours to prepare the taxes of one person, at least in the United States. And if you want to scale 20 times, you got to put in 20 more tax preparers. Of course, this assumes using only labor and no software and anything else. Alright, this is the long-run average cost curve at constant returns to scale. It's just horizontal and it coincides with the marginal cost. Is it the same in a textbook?
Yes.
Alright. Economies of scope. So, economies of scale is associated with increasing the quantity supplied, the output. You double the number of barrels, the number of taxes, the number of professors or students and whatnot. Economies of scope is associated with multi-product firm. For example, producing crude oil, but also producing natural gas at the same time. So when you're producing both and the cost of producing both is less than producing each one separately, then you have economies of scope. A classic example of economies of scope will be cars and trucks. A lot of car companies also use like mini trucks, alright? Mitsubishi is a well-known example. Mercedes has one of the best trucks in the world. Volvo produces both cars and trucks. In this case, you got economies of scope because it's a whole lot cheaper to produce 5,000 cars and 5,000 trucks than one firm producing only 5,000 cars and the other one producing 5,000 trucks. In other words, in this particular case, the concept of specialization kind of like reverses. You're not gaining from one business specializing cars only, another business specializing trucks only. Actually, you get what is known in the business world as synergies. Synergies. Synergies is the effect of knowing how to do two different things and each helping the other. The classic example of synergy in economics will be when a professor in microeconomics teaches macro so that in micro course can provide macro examples and in macroeconomics courses can provide micro examples. Another type of synergy is someone who deals in economics and at the same time finance. Right? That would be me. Right? So I can get to enjoy extra synergies. The insight getting from economics is way more important than the insights of the specialist finance professor. Because half of the finance and investments, at least in the investment world, returns and everything else of oil, currencies, blah, 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 is driven by macroeconomics, and macro fundamental analysis plays a key role. You can't just rely on investment returns from the company. The fundamentals of the company may be great. An example will be BMW. Excellent fundamentals, technology, blah, blah, blah. But global economy slips into a recession. Suddenly they can't sell anymore in the US. Sales are falling in Europe. sales are falling in Asia, and suddenly demand for BMWs is collapsing. They quote a number of 30%. Well, those who've seen the credit crisis spreading from the United States to the rest of the world would have had no trouble foreseeing the troubles of BMW, all right? So that's an example of a synergy between economics and investments. Well, very well-known synergy is between the production of crude oil and natural gas. Well, one of the reasons is that you use more or less similar technology. You use the synergy of geology. Geology is more or less the same scientists, you know, finding and searching for oil is more or less the same and uses the same techniques as the finding and searching for natural gas and whatnot. So you actually gain extraordinary synergies in producing oil as well as gas. I've always wondered why Saudi Arabia doesn't want to get in big time into the natural gas industry, but it's a whole different topic to discuss down the road, not tonight. Alright, so the cost of producing X and Y is less than the cost of producing X separately from the cost of producing Y. And in this case, you call it economies of scope. Conglomerates is, for example, an airline merges with an insurance industry. So a conglomerate is a combination of different businesses, typically unrelated, because you may have related businesses like commercial banking and insurance. Both are different types of financial services. You have financial conglomerates. A commercial bank merges and begins to operate an investment bank, merges and begins to operate a brokerage account, etc., etc. All different types of financial services. They claim that they enjoy economies of scope. Well, now we find that they actually enjoy this economies of scope. Actually running the two at the same time is even costlier, because not only have to run the one, you also have to run the other, but you also need a lot of levels of management to coordinate the two businesses, all right? For example, water pumps for a truck and a car might be almost the same. You reuse them. Tires will be almost the same, a little bigger size, you reuse them. Brake pads and all those things, they're conceptually the same, you reuse them. For financial, turned out that that's not really the case. So, economies of scope exist when one firm produces more than one product, and the cost of producing them jointly is less than the cost of producing them separately. Alright, we should be getting very close to the end. Relation between short-run and long-run cost. Well, the relationship is fairly straightforward. In the short run, you're always stuck with whatever your fixed capital or fixed input is. In the long run, you can always adjust the one input or the other so as to move to optimality. So, it is necessarily always true that in the long run you will be always more efficient than in the short run. Because in the short run you're stuck either with laborers or with capital or with whatever. So, because of the better, higher flexibility of the long run has always lower average costs. A different way to think, very financial way to think about it, is in the long run you have the option to change inputs. The option to change input has a value, so every time you got two or more options, it is always more valuable than having one choice, like your exam, right? If you don't have any choice, you're always worse off than if you have two choices. With two choices, you can always choose the one or choose the other. So, there are always ways to choose, and choices in economics and in finance we call options. And options never have a negative value. Usually, almost always, they have a positive value. So when you have options in production, the result is lowering the cost. Well, in the short run, you don't have options with at least one of the inputs, because it's fixed. In the long run, you have the options, and because you have the options, the long run cost, average cost at least, falls. Let's see, for all average curves, point of tangency. Okay, this, let's show it because it's complicated. Let's show it here. It's very easy to see. This represents one short run average average cost. This is the cost structure if capital was 10. So, if the company is stuck with a capital of 10, you can think of it stuck with 10 classrooms in the university. This is the cost structure. Of course, you can increase with the same quantity of classrooms, you can increase the MBA students, but you've got to hire more professors, use the rooms inefficiently, etc. So soon enough, the cost will begin to rise. Alternatively, you can have 30 classrooms, and then the cost structure is different. Now you can adjust more. 30 classrooms means that you can use them all for evening classes, so you can expand dramatically the quantity of evening classes, etc., etc. So the cost structure is different, will be falling, possibly, and then you can have a capital of 100, you're going to have still a third cost structure. Well, if you're stuck here, this is where you're going to be producing, somewhere over here. If you're stuck here, you're going to be producing over here. If you're stuck here, you're going to be producing over here. Well, in the long run, you can change if you choose to 10, if you choose to 30, and if you choose to 100. So, in the long run curve, this curve R is attained from capital of 10, which is attainable. This curve, or point N, is attainable with capital of 30. So, this is from 10, 12, 14, 15, 30, 40, 50, 60, whatever, all the way to 100. In other words, the long run cost curve is attained, we get it by each point representing different quantity of the fixed capital. So, in the short run it is fixed, so this is it. In the long run it is flexible. So, this, which is represents, you got to understand, there's a second curve right next to it, and a third curve, and a fourth curve, and a fifth curve, and a sixth curve. In other words, if you have capital from 1 to 100, you're going to have 100 little curves, and they're going to be right next to each other. And this curve, which sits right outside, touching at least one of them, we call the envelope. So, this is the envelope, and the long run average cost represents the envelope of short run average cost curves at for different capital or quantities of capital. So this is the quantity of high capital, the quantity of low capital. As you can see here, the long run average cost will be initially falling, later on rising. This over here will represent the lowest possible cost in the long run. Alright, because, restructuring and short run cost. Restructuring simply means changing the size of the company significantly. Restructuring simply means either expanding dramatically or, more often, cutting down dramatically of capital. For example, restructuring means a taxi company in Riyadh which opens with 1,000 taxi drivers and 1,000 taxis, and it turns out there isn't enough market for 1,000, so they keep running losses and losses and losses, and they cut down the workers to only 500, and the taxes to 500. So, restructuring is associated, the way to think in economics is associated with substantially changing one of the fixed inputs. Because the fixed input is usually capital, It means a significant change in capital. Sure, we can add one more room over here. You know, we can always put in an extra room. But that's not really restructuring. We have 30 rooms, adding the 31st room, that's not really restructuring. What the university is doing right now is a real restructuring. It's building a whole building with 50 brand new rooms. So we're going to be more than doubling the capacity of the university, or at least the male college. So this is what restructuring is. In the real world, people understand it very differently. Restructuring is always understood in one way. The company is laying off workers. Now, usually it's associated with the company has, let's say, 50 airplanes, whichever, let's say, the air company's got 50 airplanes. Well, too many airplanes, too few workers. So the result is we gotta lay off, you know, the pilots and the crews and everyone else associated with those 20 airplanes. So this means a lot of layoffs are coming. So usually in the real world, restructuring is associated with shrinking the company because it is too large and too inefficient and has very bloated, that's how we call it, bloated cost structure. Too many people working in there. An example of restructuring a little bit down the road, what I see happening right now is universities opening office for research, an office for this, an office for that, and whatnot, like 30, 40 different offices. Well, soon enough, the structure in universities is always getting too bloated. Not just here, same in Bulgaria, same in America, same in Africa. Usually the way universities operate, they start young. We call them in business lean and mean. You know what lean means? It means not a lot of fat. In other words, not a lot of bureaucrats that are draining. And then you add a research center, then you add a career center, then you add whatnot. Our American university in Bulgaria, you know, very early on, started very lean and mean. We had like 15 bureaucrats and administrators. Right now, the university has 50 professors and 150 other personnel. Drivers and, you know, all sorts of offices for all sorts of things. Secretaries. The provost has 2 secretaries. Why a provost would need 2 secretaries? The president of the university has got 2 secretaries. You know, we had, meaning over there, extremely bloated structure. 3 times more bureaucrats. Back in the old days, very prominent, one of the most prominent in the United States is Ohio State University that I graduated. Was very early on, 30, 40, 50, 60, well, it's over 100 years old. It had, for a professor, it had roughly 20 students on average, 15 students on average, and every professor was corresponding half a bureaucrat, half administrative staff. So, 100 professors, 50 administrative staff. Now the university is bloated to the point where for 100 professors have like 400 administrative staff. So, relative to professors, administration has grown 8 times. So they're saying, which is almost literally, that the number of administrators relative to professors and relative to students has increased 10 times. 10 times. You gotta imagine what it means. This is the nature of bureaucracy. Bureaucracy. The same thing works with government, the same things work anytime you have administrators. It has nothing to do with Bulgaria, it has nothing to do with Saudi Arabia, it has nothing to do with America. It is the same everywhere. It's the same in Japan too. It's very, very prominent in China now. In other words, bureaucracy has the nature and tendency to multiply and to increase, where the number of productive workers remains relatively constant, or they produce more or less the same output, but you gain more and more on bureaucrats, administrators, coordinators, and a whole bunch of other.
But isn't that good for the employees themselves?
Hmm?
At least they find a job.
No, no. Why Saudi Aramco just doesn't buy hire 1 million Saudis? You know, it's going to solve the unemployment problem right away.
But you mean because if they increase its inefficiency?
Yeah, it's going to increase it. That's the point. The point is that bureaucracy increases overall inefficiencies in any business, in any institution, whether it's Aramco or Ohio State University. The point is that most of the times as bureaucracy increases, and here's the economic term, the marginal product from bureaucrat falls dramatically. The marginal product falls. So suddenly Career Center has not 2 people but 3 people. Well, think about it. What's going to happen if the Career Center just shut down?
Nothing will happen.
Nothing will happen. So this means what's the benefit of the Career Center?
Nothing.
Not much. Nothing. I'm not saying anything bad about the Career Center here. They may be, they may not be, I don't know. I'm saying what typically would happen. I mean, you already got the jobs. It doesn't matter whether there is one or not. I mean, the point is that usually, you know, universities in general, bureaucracy likes to multiply. That's in their nature. Bureaucracy breeds inefficiency, and inefficiency demands more worker to cope with inefficiency. Alright? And it's a mess you can never get out. Alright? Good enough? Let's see what I was talking about. Oh, restructuring. So, short-run costs are reducing by adjusting the... So, the short-run costs, you vary, for example, professors, if you don't need them. Of course, you never cut them bureaucrats, right? So, short run, you cut the variable costs. In the long run, you cut also the fixed costs too. Alright? Let's see. We should be done. Alright, so restructuring costs and whatnot. So, it shows you short run expansion path and long run expansion path. In the short run, if you're from point E, you move to point S. This is the short-run expansion path. So, the assumption here is that capital is fixed and that labor can expand. So, in the short run, you can expand only horizontally, meaning the quantity of capital from 60 continues to be 60, and the quantity of labor increases from 90 all the way to 150. So, in the short run, expansion is along the horizontal from E to S. However, in the long run, the expansion is from E to F. In other words, it will expand early on into S, and then it will improve efficiencies by expanding down the road the capital and shrinking the labor. In other words, the short-run expansion path is always less efficient than the long run. It is less efficient because you retain the same quantity of output. This is the same quantity of 12,000, but you attain it at a higher cost. In other words, at a more outward cost, isocost curve. So, in the short run you can expand, and then over time you may move back to a more efficient. Well, in a way, this is a way to think about economic booms and busts. Talking about synergy between microeconomics and macroeconomics. In the very short run, businesses expand an awful lot by hiring a lot of people, and in the course of doing that, gaining output at the cost of inefficiencies, and when the bust comes, you gotta cut the fat, meaning you gotta lay off some workers, introduce more software, in other words, increase somewhat the quantity of capital and cut substantially the quantity of workers. So, from 90 you expanded all the way to 150. This is 60 workers. You added 60 more people. And during the bust, or down the road, the restructuring, yet you're going to lay off half of those that you added. Alright? So, this is the boom phase, and this is the bust phase, if you want to think in macro terms. All right. Classic example that we are seeing today in the United States and in Bulgaria, not yet in Saudi Arabia, but today in Dubai, is construction workers. Construction was expanding rapidly. Everyone, including my teacher in physics, high school teacher in physics, says, "Oh, I'm making so much more money in construction, why bother teach?" You know, teaching is an unrewarding profession, right? So he said, "The hell with teaching. I'm going to make 3 times more money." And he did it. Well, this was during the wild boom. Now, he's making 3 times more than a teacher. Well, the boom is over. He's now back home. He was effectively laid off. So, half of those that entered the construction businesses from anywhere and everywhere now are being released back into the labor pool. You say, well, but they're unemployed. The answer is, they're unemployed today. Doesn't mean this is a bad thing. This means that now the teacher in physics will be again a teacher in physics. All right? In other words, what the boom does is absorb a lot of labor, which becomes inherently inefficient in the short run, and the long run arrives with the bust, where you release those inefficient, or most of those inefficient workers, in this particular case half of them, back to the labor pool. They're going to find some other job. This is going to be the next booming industry, whatever that is. In the United States, it is. Is there booming industry today in the United States?
No.
Foreclosures, they're booming, right? Judges and government bureaucracy. The government is hiring bureaucrats, and for all sorts of things. Every agency in the federal agency in the United States is hiring big time for all sorts of things. I mean, I can elaborate, but I don't have to. So, there is now what's called a government boom in the United States. You guys good to go for now? Let's see, we should be done. Restructuring short-run costs, all right? I think this is it. This is over, I think. All right, we're done.